So good morning to everybody. Welcome to this next training session of the BIOMAC project. Today we are talking about a very hot topic, let's say, investment need and access to funding for small and medium enterprises. And today we have Nikos Tsiantis, project manager at Excelsis, which is also one of the many partners of the BIOMAC project. And as always, you can use the Q&A box to post your questions that we will try to answer at the end when Nikos will have concluded with his presentation. So without further ado, Nikos, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Giulio. So hello, everybody. Good afternoon. I'm Nikos Tsiantis. I'm a project manager at Excelsis. Excelsis is a partner with the BIOMAC project. And I'll try to give you a brief presentation on the investment need and the access to funding. So to go through the overview of the presentation very quickly, first, I'll start talking a little bit presenting actually why we are talking about funding and why are we talking about access to funding, and presenting very simply the problem, the selection problem, so the issue that innovators usually face when they're trying to come up with the most suitable choice of funding source for their development process. Then we're going to go through a categorization of different types of funding, different choices in general, average categorization, and then also start discussing the wide variety of factors that will be affecting, that should be affecting this selection of the most suitable funding source. Later, we will talk a little bit about the EU funding sources that are available. We'll see a very small overview and very quickly going through the most suitable choices for SMEs as usual, and also we will see an example from Horizon Europe. And then, of course, we will discuss about the connection of the BIOMAC Open Innovation Testbed with these issues. So to start, when we are discussing about innovation and when we are talking about developing some new process, some new materials, some new products, developing something new, something novel, something that has potential, we're always discussing in some way about three different types of investment. An investment of knowledge, so the idea, the invention itself, why is it innovative, why do we think it has potential, and all the knowledge that is associated with that is needed with that. We are always investing the time, the effort that needs to be put into developing this idea, working with this idea, testing, upgrading, and getting closer to the market. And of course, we are always discussing about an investment of money, which is what we usually call funding. So these are the three different types of investments that everybody is including in their way of thinking. And we are discussing about investment of money. When we are discussing about funding, we can usually come up with some very common examples, very stereotypical, let me say, examples. So when we are discussing about startup companies, we usually consider options like venture capital. So we usually think of startup companies going to venture capitals and presenting their ideas, pitching their ideas in order to get funding from there. When on the other side, when we're talking about small businesses in general, we usually traditionally think of bank lending, so getting loans from banks and moving forward with setting up your small businesses. Of course, not exclusively, I'm just making some very simple examples. Similarly, when we're talking about researchers in research and technology organizations, in universities, we usually think of some kind of either European funding, I mean, us as Europeans, or we're using ideas coming from national funding sources, etc. And then when we think about large enterprises, whatever the sector, we tend to have examples, very common examples in our minds about other types of funding, like corporate bonds or private equity, capital raises, etc. So the question then, when you're looking at the problem of what funding source is appropriate for what case, is first, what are the criteria for the selection that you should be considering? And then once we start discussing the criteria, the natural question that comes next, of course, in each particular case, is what is the optimal choice for this case? So what is the optimal case? What is the optimal choice of funding source for our own case or for some other specific case that we are considering? So if you consider the problem from the perspective of the innovator, of the owner of a small company, of a startup company, spin-off, SME, especially in the case that these persons, they are not very familiar with that, they have never done that before, it's maybe the first time they are considering about a case like that, the first time they're setting up something like that. Usually they start approaching this issue in a very similar way of thinking. They usually start by trying to find what are the usual options. They try to come up with examples. They're looking at examples similar to their case and trying to find out what they did. So if you're a startup company, you're used to looking at examples of other startup companies and what did they do, what kind of process they had followed. And in this way, you're perceiving the problem in a way that you're trying to mimic choices, you're trying to see if this would work in your own case. And this is something that has certain pitfalls. And those pitfalls are that at the end, you will end up with some choice that is not optimal, that is suboptimal, and that you might be missing opportunities, that you might be resulting in reduced growth, or you might be creating limitations in your own situation. And a very good example in this case is the example of innovative, high-tech, small and medium enterprises, of startups that are relying on intangibles, are relying on ideas and beyond state-of-the-art technologies and advancements that they have made or they have been testing in very low levels of readiness. And those type of companies, usually they have a little bit more limitations when, for example, they consider ideas of funding that are within the traditional bank lending sector. It is, of course, obvious. And I will talk about that a little bit later on. Then, when you start looking at the problem a little bit more in detail, and you start examining more options and more options for different funding sources, different types of funding sources, I don't necessarily mean different sources of the same type. And you start doing comparisons between each other and start to look at the pros and cons and the different requirements they have and how can you meet some of them, but you have problems with different ones. Then you come up with all those different limitations that are very complex, can sometimes be overlapping, and it creates a problem that is non-obvious how to solve it. And it can create actually a situation that is difficult and risky in moving on with your business plan. It is definitely not impossible. So it is, of course, always possible so that you make a choice, go on with it, and get very, very lucky. But it's still difficult and risky. So what we usually talk about in this type of cases that we need a more complete approach. And this is some kind of knowledge that needs to be more highlighted in this type of situations, especially when considering innovative SMEs and startups, that we need a more complete approach, a better understanding of all the different options of funding that there are available, and how and which ones of them could be suitable for your case in order for us to be able to pin down the one that should be considered optimal for the particular case every time. So moving on to the presentation of, as I said, the categorization of the different types of funding. There are many different methodologies that could be viewed here. I've chosen to present to you a very generic one that was presented actually by the OECD a few years back. And as I said, this is a very generic one. I will then discuss a little bit more how this can be further specialized and refined for each particular case. But this categorization is actually based on the risk-return ratio. So we're trying here to categorize different funding sources in different categories based on being low risk return, medium, or high. So in the case of low risk return types of funding, we have two subcategories. The first one is the traditional one, the asset-based finance. Here you have options like factoring, like purchase orders, leasing, and of course you have the most common, traditionally going back literally centuries, the asset-based lending. So getting a loan and putting some kind of an asset as a collateral, for example, or something like that. And then you have another subcategory that is usually called by economists alternative debt, where you have other options like corporate bonds or securitizing debt or private placings, or even crowdfunding in terms of collecting money that would be then the debt of your own company. So these are types of funding that could, generically speaking, be categorized as low risk, low return in this type of problem. And then going to the category of the medium risk return types of funding, you have what we call hybrid instruments. In this category, you can find things like silent participations and profit rights from participations, participation loans, some other types of bonds like convertible bonds, mezzanine finance, etc. I'm not going to try to explain what each of those categories are, because that would take actually very, very long and it wouldn't make sense. What I'm trying to show is that these categories actually include quite a lot of tools, quite a lot of types of funding that you might have seen or be familiar with, and that you already start thinking that those are types of funding that are used by very different companies for very different reasons, or very different organizations with different strategies. And moving on to the high risk, high return types of funding, here we have what we call equity instruments. You have, of course, private equity, the venture capitals that I previously mentioned as well, or business angels, some specialized platforms that you find for small and medium enterprises, or you have crowdfunding in terms of collecting money that is then in return for equity. And as I said, this categorization is a very generic one. It can become more case specific once you try to refine it, and once you try to take into account all the key factors that should be the criteria for the selection of the most suitable choices for any particular case. And then in this case, you can actually make a more accurate and a more analytical categorization, going from not just 3 categories, but way more. So what type of factors should be considered for these types of further categorization? Of course, we need to consider geographical factors. So as you can imagine, there are different options and there are different ratios of risk and return for an organization that is in Japan, different ones for one that is in Germany, and different ones for an organization that is in Great Britain or in the United States. And this is just one of the factors. Then, of course, there are a lot of factors that are related with the industry that you are talking about and the market that you're talking about. As you can understand, there are different commonly used, let's say, solutions in terms of funding sources and with different risk-return ratios for the plastic industry, for the energy industry, then things are completely different when it comes to ICT, software development, or when it comes, for example, to communication technologies. Then one thing that I guess most of you would be already familiar with, it has to do with the development stage, especially, for example, when we're talking about startups. The development stage that you find your organization in has a lot to do with what type of funding and what type of risk-return ratio should you be expecting or pursuing, if you wish. So you have a different types of parameters to consider once you are in the concept validation phase, and completely different when you are already going to market introduction, or if you are in the lab prototyping stage, completely different to a very large company already established going for market expansion. Another factor that plays a key role in this, of course, is the strategic goals of the innovator, of the one asking these questions. So this can, again, make a very huge difference on the choice of already suitable funding sources, changing what the optimal of those funding sources should be considered. And then there are very important and many case-dependent particularities. So I guess you can already think of particularities that have to do with the partnerships that you have already established, or the partnerships that you need to establish, any dependencies that you have in your company in many different types of aspects. So in aspects of market, in aspects of logistics, in aspects of even financing, already having some dependencies. And then, of course, you have IPR and you have technological aspects, and you can think of way more, especially if you want to go into details. So to talk a little bit more about our particular subjects, which is EU funding, since we are a European project, and we wanted to discuss a little bit more about EU funding instruments and EU funding sources. So what I tried to present here is an overview of the funding programs of the European Union. You can find in the link that I have here, in the official website of the European Commission, very good presentation of this with the links for each of those different types of funding, different funding programs. And you can see here different funding programs being associated with different strategic goals of the European Union and different areas that the European Union is trying to assist research and innovation, is trying to assist resilience, completely different industrial sectors. So you have funding programs going from defense and security to social sciences, to agriculture, technology, particular technological fields. So you have different funding programs for low TRL, low technology readiness level technology and science, and you have others for higher. You have different funding sources, for example, for particular markets and particular technological fields. What you would be then more interested in looking at in particular would be the overview of the EU funding sources that are traditionally preferred and from SMEs. So what SMEs are usually focusing on, mainly, of course, but not exclusively. And of course, you have Horizon Europe. BIOMAC is actually a project funded by Horizon 2020, which is the predecessor of Horizon Europe. Horizon Europe is focusing on research and innovation in general. It's the biggest and the main scene for research and innovation. And then you have other funding sources like the CEF, the Connecting Europe Facility, which is focusing a little bit more particularly on energy, transport, and ICT, or the Single Market Program. which is actually looking to improve and benefit SMEs in terms of their access to finance and markets. You have particularly developed funding programs that have to do with agriculture and rural development. You have the SME Fund, which is looking to help and support IP protection of SMEs. And you have other instruments as well, like the microfinance support for developing new small businesses, or the social fund for supporting competitiveness of small businesses, and other particular tools lying within, for example, the EU cohesion policy, which is managed in a national level by each of the EU countries, or from the LIFE program, focusing on green technologies, services, things that are close to the market and have to do with climate action, etc. And I wanted to give you an example of Horizon Europe. So Horizon Europe, I've used here the table that most of you will probably already have seen. This is a table developed by the European Commission that they have been using in all the introductory presentations and explanation of Horizon Europe. And what you can see here are these different pillars of Horizon Europe and these different sub-programs, let's say, focusing on different technology readiness levels, focusing on the different clusters that they have, so different fields of research and innovation. And this already, when you start looking at that and you imagine yourself having to make this selection of an appropriate funding source for an SME, this already starts creating some limitations and some factors that you need to take into account. So I already mentioned, for example, the technology readiness level, so the different development stages. And then you also have to start considering that different targets that are set already within the description of this funding program. These different targets are industry related, they are subject related, they're very, very specific. And then all these different types of sub-programs, they might be having some different type of funding, some different type of rules for this funding, and they're trying to achieve some specific goals in its case. So when you then start to looking a little bit more closer to particular choices that might be looking interesting to you, for example, as an SME, you then start noticing some particularities that lie within the different proposal preparation that you need to submit in order to get this funding. And all these different sub-programs, they have differences in terms of the length of the proposal that you need to prepare, the structure, differences in the focus of the proposal or the focus of the different chapters of the proposal. You have different criteria in the evaluation, criteria that you need to meet in order to successfully get the funding. And of course, different requirements. So the eligibility can be quite different from going from one to the other. And what I'm trying to create here is I'm trying to paint a picture of how going from the very generic problem of which type of funding should I choose to even the more particular problem of, okay, let's try to see what do I need to do to get this type of funding. This can be quite a complex road. And in the example of the Horizon Europe that I'm making here, imagine that the success rate, of course, is not 100%. So in the predecessor of Horizon Europe, Horizon 2020, we had success rates as issued by the Commission in the range of 10 to 15% most of the times in different sub-programs, some funding programs. And you had numerous examples of ideas being submitted as proposals, the result coming out as a failure, and then once in a later stage, you would resubmit this idea with very minor details changed, you would result in funding. So that meant that your idea was not bad, it meant that there were some other factors that I mentioned earlier that you probably overlooked the first time, and these were the reason they resulted to failure in the first place. And then you have the factor that you also need to consider is that most of those Horizon Europe projects, they're collaborative projects and they can be quite multidimensional. So the idea the SME is trying to develop, for example, in my example, would be just a small part of what the project is trying to achieve. So that can create quite a lot of different issues that need to be tackled. So you need to establish a consortium, and this consortium establishment requires quite a lot of technology transfer principles, I say here. So it needs you to set up these complex collaborations. It needs you to understand all the different types of things the proposal needs us to address, and it needs you to be able to see a bigger picture, something that can be quite complex for an SME to consider just on their own. And again, of course, a lot of experience can be very, very beneficial in this type of application for funding. And this is something I'm using here, the Horizon Europe example, because we're all we are usually participating in Horizon Europe examples. BIOMAC is a Horizon 2020 project, so you're very familiar, I guess, most of you with this. But this is something that is true for quite a lot of different types of funding sources as well, very different funding sources, not even European funding sources. Submitting a proposal and trying to pursue a specific funding source to get some funding can actually require quite a lot of experience in the way that you need to prepare this submission, and with technicalities coming into place, and having experience from how these things are evaluated usually, how they have been evaluated in the past, how you need to present something, and this something can be even the value of your innovation. So what you want to develop is already something that you know, but the way that you present it might need some experience in this type of submissions for funding. And of course, this exists and it's true in Horizon Europe. So what this has revealed in Horizon 2020, in FP7, FP6, even before that, is that most of the times this end up creating this need for some help from someone that has experience. So a lot of consulting companies like our own company, and a lot of experienced groups from universities, from research institutions that have a lot of hands-on experience with applying for this particular type of funding that we're discussing here as an example. Once they help with the application for this type of funding, once they help with the creation of a consortium, as I mentioned here, for example, this can highly reduce the risks of actually failing to get the funding. And sorry, what I'm trying to say is that this can be actually a very complex problem. And as I showed you, the parameters that need to be considered in each particular case for the selection of the most appropriate funding source can be actually a very, very wide variety of parameters that are both intuitive and non-intuitive. So parameters that can be obvious and parameters that are not obvious at the beginning, or they are indirectly affecting factors, etc. And this can result to a very complex problem. And in order not to miss opportunities, usually some kind of aid is what SME owners and what especially smaller companies like spin-offs, startups, what they are seeking. So the connection of BIOMAC with all of this. So BIOMAC is an EU-funded project. There's a project funded by Horizon 2020. And the total funding of BIOMAC is around 15 million. The total cost is around 17 million. And of course, a lot of this funding is going into the establishment of the Open Innovation Testbed. So in testing, in improving, in upscaling the technology readiness level of the pilot lines, preparing the services that will be offered within the Open Innovation Testbed, and bringing everything to a readiness level that is appropriate. But then some funding is also allocated in the what we call the open call of the Open Innovation Testbed, the BIOMAC Open Innovation Testbed open call. And why this is important is because this can actually be very valuable to some kind of a small company. In our example, in the example I'm considering a small medium enterprise that wants to engage with the services of the BIOMAC Open Innovation Testbed. So this type of company will, of course, need some kind of an investment in order to be able to cover the costs of the services that will be that they require from the BIOMAC Open Innovation Testbed. And the open call provides just that, provides the funding that is necessary, provides this covers this investment. But what we then do within the Open Innovation Testbed is we're also considering subsequent research, subsequent development. So after the end of the project that an interested third party would be engaging with BIOMAC, with the Open Innovation Testbed, what we then need to consider is how to assist and how to help with this particular SME going for further development and further upgrading the technology readiness level, going towards the markets and following the business plan that they have or that they are actually building. Some more investment will most probably be necessary. And for this investment, funding can actually, most of the times, be a prerequisite. So what the Open Innovation Testbed is offering is a wide variety of services, including some services that are the innovation management services. So the innovation management services would then be, I have it here, we have a range of innovation management services, starting from a business plan, moving to an exploitation risk assessment, of course, the IPR management and pattern mapping analysis, and what we call the investment need assessment. So as you can understand, this assessment would, of course, first, it would need the information, quite a lot of information and output from the other types of innovation management services. And what we are hoping that we will be able to provide is assistance and help to the innovators, to the BIOMAC Open Innovation Testbed clients, the end users, as we call them, to move forward with the development of their idea and follow their business plan in subsequent steps and in further development. And the main dependencies for this assessment, of course, would be, I have them here, some of those main dependencies, the IP protection, the development status, and the strategic goals that, as I mentioned, things that have to do with what collaborations they have, what collaborations they need for further development, some aspects that have to do with open innovation, and of course, things that are research related, have to do with the field and particular technological aspects, and of course, what is the financial plan, what is the financial analysis. So what we then want to be able to do is put all those things together and come up not only with projection, financial analysis projection with certain scenarios, but also being able to assess what the further investment need would be and be able to assess what the optimal choices of additional funding sources would be and provide some support in the pursuit of this BIOMAC Open Innovation Testbed end user in to get this further funding that they will need in the future. And I'm going to go a little bit back. So I showed you here how the innovation management services are actually trying to help SMEs not secure, but approach a little bit more systematically and more efficiently the problem of finding funding for continuing their development process, for further working on upgrading their technology readiness level after engaging the services of BIOMAC. I already mentioned, of course, how the open call provides the necessary funding for several of the applicants, the ones that will be selected, in order for them to engage with the particular services of the BIOMAC Open Innovation Testbed already. But what we're also going to be doing is using some of the work that is included within the innovation management services to already assist in a very first and very brief step the interested users, the interested SMEs that are approaching BIOMAC already from this stage, already from the very beginning of their engagement procedure with BIOMAC, which is something that can help BIOMAC in the future. So in post-project, after the open call, once the Open Innovation Testbed will be operating autonomously outside, I mean, the Horizon 2020 funded project of BIOMAC. So what we have been working on is a very quick overview and some very brief documentation that could be found helpful for interested clients of the Open Innovation Testbed, so for the end users, but also for existing members of the Open Innovation Testbed, with additional funding schemes that can be identified and categorized as I already showed. And we try to do that on European level, but also on a national level and a regional level, making such types of analysis and identifications for each of the countries that are participating, are represented, within the BIOMAC project. And in this way, we would be able to provide some very, let's say, first touch consulting services, supporting the engagement of additional funding for OITB members that would be interested. And what you see on the right is just a very draft example, a snapshot from a table considering the particular case for funding sources that are available for Greek companies. So that was all from my side. Thank you very much, and I will be happy to try to answer to any questions you might have.
Thank you, Nikos, for the presentation. And yes, please, if you have any question for Nikos, please, this is time to use the Q&A panel. Yeah, I would just add a comment to what you said at some point, and you listed all the available funding programs and schemes that are available. This is already a challenging task, for an SME, understanding the framework, the overall picture. I had some past experience in that, and I would, since you mentioned them, one good choice is to start from your own region, because as most of us know, European funds are also managed at a regional level. So you have calls for funding that could be about setting up new SMEs or supporting in investing in certain specific goods or high technology stuff and so on. So always remember that in your own region, you have plenty of opportunities that sometimes you are totally unaware that exist. And then when the SMEs grows, it is able to access the more challenging call, like the European Innovation Council calls, or the Horizon Europe calls themselves.
Okay. I remember to very quickly add something to your comment, Julia.
Yeah.
I remember prior to starting to work for Excelixis, while I was working as a researcher, I remember that I already thought that I knew quite a lot of different types of funding sources, and I already thought that I have a good idea, of how you can start your own company and how you can find funding. And then once I started working in the particular field, I realized I already knew nothing. So I already thought that everything is within Horizon 2020
No.
and a few national types of funding sources, a few funding sources that I included in the very, very common examples like venture capitals and things that are used by more traditional small businesses or from large enterprises. And I realized that this is actually quite a more complex problem. It's not a problem that has a singular solution. So it's not something that, it's not a problem that you're approached by an SME and you can answer to the SME, there are 3 options, choose one of those 3. That is not the case. It is something that is completely case dependent.
Exactly. And also the size of the SMEs depends a lot what the SMEs can actually do in terms of complex application or not. Also, there are calls for funding that require the search for European partners. So this is also another step, which is not very easy if you're a very small SME. So always start from the bottom, so the regional funds, and then as you grow up, you can access other opportunities. There's a question actually, projects from India can apply. Well, I would say it depends, but
yes. So if we're talking about European funding in general, of course it depends. It depends on what type of funding sub-program we are discussing about. Regarding, for example, Horizon Europe, which is the main type of funding we are discussing for this particular types of projects we are considering ourselves being involved already in a European project. Horizon Europe usually doesn't have restrictions on that. It has, if there is a restriction for a particular topic that is published by the European Union, those restrictions would have then to be explicitly mentioned in the description of the topic, I believe. And in every topic, there is a very, very long, no, actually not very long, sorry. There is a very concise description that is followed by quick links going to every rule and every regulation, especially those that have to do with eligibility requirements. But usually companies from media are eligible for participation in those.
Yeah, then I don't remember if it's also the case in Horizon Europe, but at least in Horizon 2020, there were also dedicated calls to EU.
Yes.
And country X cooperation. Remember South Korea or Canada, what else? There
Yes.
are dedicated.
And then there are those, exactly, there are those types of funding that are particularly focusing on collaborations between the EU and particular countries or geographical locations. So for example, there is a collaboration with Africa and entire funding programs that don't necessarily, they don't necessarily involve, for example, humanitarian aid or something like that. They are actual funding programs that are looking to embrace and to enhance and to support collaboration on a business level, on a technological level with Africa, and the same thing exists with China. I believe I had seen something about India as well, but I'm not 100% certain.
Yeah, Google will have the answer, I guess. So I make one last call for the attendees to submit their questions, and in the meantime, there is a question. Can independent researcher apply or need collaborator from an academic institute, or the collaboration with an academic institute is essential?
So for independent researchers, there is actually a very wide variety of topics they can apply for in Horizon Europe. If we talk about Horizon Europe, there are a lot of, as I said, different funding programs have different rules. I made an example with Horizon Europe because this is the most common one we are discussing these days. But yes, so for example, independent researchers can apply for Marie Sklodowska-Curie funding, or for funding from the ERC, the European Research Council, and other types of funding from different types of funding programs. But yes, for individuals, there is always this opportunity, and those types of funding can be different on depending on the level of the researcher as well. So for postgraduate researchers that are prior to getting their PhD, or for PhDs that are looking to have a postdoc, or for experienced researchers, principal innovators, there are many different types of funding, including, of course, independent researchers as well.
Okay, great. So I would like to ask you maybe a final comment. You have already talked about it, but in a okay, they thank you for your response. So you have one last chance to submit your questions while I ask Nikos this last thing. So you touched upon the open call in BIOMAC. So what can practically the attendees or the SMEs who are going to participate in the open call, that I would like to remember is still open, and you have time until the beginning of June to submit your application. What an SME can expect in terms of assistance related to the search for EU funding? Can these complementary services that you mentioned are guiding the SMEs through the framework, finding the right call, the right opportunity? They can expect some assistance and also in the writing of the proposal. What's the matter?
So yes, first, because I don't want to sound very I don't want to be misunderstood. The European Commission, in their official website, in the funding and tenders portal, they have provided very, very helpful descriptions for all these different types of funding. And they have provided with tutorials, they have provided with templates, explanations of who they're targeting, who can find these types of funding programs useful, how can you apply. They explain pretty much everything. It is not an easy task to go through all this, because it is quite a lot of reading, and it can become actually in some cases very prone to misunderstanding in terms of missing some technical opportunities, some technical terminology. But the explanations are already there, so we're not talking about revealing some secret knowledge that we have and no one else has. What I tried to say is that usually this type of innovation management services can be found very beneficial, especially for SMEs, spin-offs, startup companies, because those are usually companies that are created by innovators that don't have access to many other means that a larger enterprise would have, and that are more limited in traditional types of acquiring funding. And because a lot of those funding sources require the submission of a very particular, let's say, technical, sometimes very elaborate, some other times, type of proposal. So some kind of a folder, they need quite a lot of requirements. This can be quite a hard task to be managed by individual SMEs. So usually there are a lot of experts in the field that can be quite helpful in guiding, assisting through the entire process, or just consulting at the beginning of the process, or even executing the process for you. And this is not new, of course. This is something that is used for decades now. The example of European funding also includes these types of examples. So for decades now that European funding has been available, for those same decades, there have been people working a lot in this particular field and working in order to assist innovators, provide this type of services, help them prepare quite a lot of documentation for that, or help them go through the entire process together. In terms of the case of BIOMAC, so what is very, very helpful and what is very critical to understand is that first, BIOMAC gives an opportunity for something to be developed, so an entire project, upscaling an idea using those services that BIOMAC provides. So using the pilot lines, using the infrastructure of BioMeans, initially for free through the open call, right? So this is the biggest opportunity that I wanted to highlight. So BIOMAC is actually providing funding on its own through the open call for innovators that are interested in doing something similar, something using all this experience that BIOMAC already has created. But then the innovation management services already exist within BIOMAC as well, in order to provide some assistance for the future, for further development after taking the step of BIOMAC. So for the next step of the SME, of the startup company, of any interested end user. And this can be actually quite helpful as well. But the most important thing is that the open call is actually an opportunity that is for someone that is that wants to do some kind of a project like that, is an opportunity that you don't pass very easily. It's actually providing the funding to do the development using something that has already been tested and has already been established into a consortium and into an open innovation testbed.
Thank you, Nikos. So there are no other questions, and we are also approaching the time limit. So I thank you for your presentation. I thank you, the attendees. And as always, the recording will be available soon on the YouTube channel of the BIOMAC project. So remember to follow all our training sessions and apply for the open call, of course. Thank you again, Nikos. Bye. Bye, everybody.
Thank you very much.